for you and me, Spanish would you speak?
6:27 in Trinidad and Tobago. You know, there's a lot to cuss the public sector for, but the private sector ain't too backward. I've been locked out of my online bank accounts. But anyway, so you can't get through during the day. So I said, let me try early in the morning. But before I was put on hold, but I couldn't wait. I had to come to do this show. I was told you could dial the 10-number extension to reach a certain person. 10 numbers to reach somebody? I mean, people don't think about these things. 10 numbers where's that person? In the Outer Hebrides, in the Marshall Islands, in Mongolia? 10 numbers? Jeez. All right, but anyway, let's focus on politics in the Sister Isle. As yet another resignation from the PDP, the Progressive Democratic Patriots executive, was made public yesterday. General Secretary Anne Natasha II has called it quits, and this follows the mass resignations which occurred on the eve of the PDP's 1 year in office anniversary. Remember, they won convincingly December the 6th last year, 14-1, and it has since collapsed. Well, Martin George, the president of the Tobago Business Chamber, well-known attorney at law, very prominent in the business community, in the legal fraternity, very forthright with his perspectives on many different issues related to governance and business. Mr. George, very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. What do you make of these latest developments? The PDP or the no longer members of the PDP? Good morning to you.
Yes, hi, good morning to you, Fazil. And just on a side note, it's actually even more frustrating using the U.S. banking system because they send you from one voice automated system to another, to another, to another. You hardly ever get to speak to a real person. So, it may not be as bad as we have it here, but that's an aside. The fact of the matter is, Fazil, it's actually 3 resignations that I saw noted yesterday. Not just Ms. Anne Natasha II. Apparently, the deputy chairman also resigned, and that's Mr. Cohen. Right, I saw a notification of that, and I saw another executive member also resign. So I think I saw 3 persons resign yesterday. Now, the interesting aspect of this is the fact that these are not persons who are assemblymen within the THA. So, it makes it a little more concerning, I would think, for Mr. Watson Duke, because it does now begin to appear almost as a version of, the childhood story, The Emperor Has No Clothes, because you basically are appearing to be in a scenario where it's like the cheese is standing alone. So I think that there is definitely a crisis of confidence, a crisis of credibility that the PDP as a party is facing, where you have not just the persons who are in the assembly with Mr. Farley Augustine who have resigned, but you now have just your normal executive members. So you can't say, well, they're doing it to cling on to power in the assembly. You see, and that's where I think that these 3 are interesting.
And what does that represent, Martin George? Because, I mean, political machinations and games and whatever, okay, maybe PDP is now effectively a one-man show, and Watson will no doubt talk about, reinforcing his base, and you will see who really in charge with the next election and so on. But has that created a level of uncertainty within either not just the broader electorate, but the business community as far as the business of Tobago moving forward into 2023?
Well, the thing is, once you have any political instability, of course, it always creates that level of uncertainty in the business climate. You would have the scenarios where persons are now concerned about, okay, whether they're going to get paid on time and stuff like that. You've seen a couple stories surfacing about, payments either being late or in some cases where you may have had persons claiming that the checks they would have received were not honored and stuff like that. I don't know how true that story is. So, I would proceed with caution in that regard. But the fact of the matter is any level of political instability is never, ever good for the business community. I mean, of course, while you may say, well, look, it's just an internal party matter, the fact that Mr. Duke is now positing this and pivoting it as a challenge to the continued functioning of the assembly and whether it is morally right, because I think he has accepted by and large in the public space that it's a very difficult needle to thread to mount a successful legal challenge, because the THA Act is clearly totally silent on the issue of, the party politics and the issue of, whether you leave the party that, put you into power, whether you have to resign and vacate your seat, as occurs in the national parliament, right? Because Section 49(2)(e) of the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago makes it pellucid that if you were elected into the national parliament as a member of the House of Representatives on the ticket of a party, a political party, and then you fell out of favor and you either resigned or the party kicked you out and you left that party, then basically under what we call the crossing the floor provisions, you had to vacate your seat and therefore a by-election would be called. So we know that's clear in the national parliament. The THA Act does not speak of any such provision. And of course, Fazil, the legal issue we have to contemplate and wrestle with is whether the THA Act left it out by accident or design. In other words, that crossing the floor provision, that was an amendment made to the Constitution in 1978. So if you have the THA Act being made 2 years later in 1980, is it that they ignored that deliberately and did not want the THA Act to be subsumed under this idea of the party politics? Or is it that they forgot to include this important provision that dealt with the issue of if you left your party? So that is where Mr. Watson Duke has a very narrow wedge to try to invoke Section 92 of the Standing Orders of the THA to say, look, it's silent on this issue, so therefore what occurs in the National Parliament should obtain.
And as you know, Martin George, whenever you give us some context, it opens up other things. You said that this crossing the floor specific element of the legislation was passed in 1978. Did I hear you correctly?
That's correct, yes.
So how come Vincent Lass and Rupert Griffith crossed the floor and got away with it?
Well, that's another issue. But if you recall, there were some court actions surrounding their issues. If you recall, there were some court actions surrounding their issues. All right. So, I mean, that's quite interesting in terms of what happened there. But the fact of the matter is that the section is there in the Constitution.
So that's why I asked the question. I mean, if it was a clip, I think it happened to Herbert Volney, who sadly passed away just a few days ago. But
yes.
Because I've always wondered about this, that they crossed the floor, even notwithstanding the legal actions. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the seats weren't declared vacant.
I don't seem to recall them being declared vacant. I think you're quite correct there.
All right.
Yes.
Okay. So, but let's get back to the substantive topic, because we're hearing as well that, and again, listening to Diane Haddad from the Tobago division of the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Industry and Commerce, they're having an event coming up on Thursday for where people want their voices to be heard and so on. There is a perspective that Farley and company are suddenly become very, very aloof, and they're not communicating with the business community. They're not even acknowledging their communications and so on. Has that been your experience as well?
Well, I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say so at all. But what I would say, though, Fazil, is that there is definitely the need for some sort of clarity to be brought to the public in Tobago and the wider public in Trinidad and Tobago, because there has to be some level of accountability, some sense of order, structure, and decorum. It cannot be that they intend to run for the next 3 years under this, generalized name of independence. So I think one way or the other, they would have to either form a political vehicle, they would have to have some umbrella organization, because questions will arise. What philosophies do you subscribe to? What are your guiding principles? What is your constitution? Where's your manifesto? What do people use to measure you by? Yes.
Okay, well, let me jump in right there, because and I was listening to Ho Choi Charles, commenting on this, as well as former Chief Secretary himself, talking about the construct of the chamber, that it's a you and it's about collaboration. The argument could be put forward, Martin George, that whether you call it PDP, their dog, or Kaka City as Port of Spain is, or XYZ, it really doesn't matter, that it is about representation of the people. And if there are 14 independents or 13 independents, whether they are under any unified banner or not, it's about deliverables to the people. And at the end of the day, that is how they're going to be judged, not so?
Well, unfortunately, that's a glorious oversimplification that people are making, And I mean, I know, of course, you wouldn't be guilty of that. But the fact of the matter is, let's just take it to its logical absurdity, in the sense of, if these persons who are there suddenly decided, 13 of them decided tomorrow morning, okay, look, we are going to go and sign up and join and become members of the UNC. And the UNC is now basically de facto in charge of the THA. The conversation will take a totally different turn. And actually, at this point, there's nothing to prevent them from doing so. In fact, they could join up and say they're signing up to become members of the PNM. If you understand me. So the reality is that while one would like to ascribe to these altruistic notions that, well, yes, you are simply there representing the people, the reality is that Trinidad and Tobago, our history is that of political vehicles, and one way or the other, persons need to know, okay, who is really representing me? Because even among the independents, okay, so let's assume, okay, they want to try to continue for 3 years as independents. We know the reality of persons' political ambitions. Even among the independents, who is going to be really the one leading them and governing them? Because all it takes is for 7 or 8 of them to say, well, listen, we no longer have confidence in Mr. Farley Augustine Monday morning, and you write and you ask for him to be removed. The THA Act provides for that. So then what? Every Monday morning, you're going to have a bloodless coup in the THA with each one wanting to be leader, each one wanting to be chief, because you basically would then have a ragtag bag of 13 independents, each of them with their own political desires, ambitions, etc., and absolutely no sense of a guiding philosophy or overarching principle that is leading them.
Well, maybe I am guilty of a glorious oversimplification in that regard, because we're going to take a break in a couple of minutes and continue the discussion. But maybe this is the test case, Martin George. Maybe this is to see whether it is really that these so-called independents are united behind Farley and they see a greater perspective about representation. So, for example, if somewhere in Charlottesville somebody say, who representing you? They say, well, your representative is there, whatever name it is, whether it's Farley, whether it's Faith Be Israel, whoever it is, whether it's the pastor and so on. The point is that maybe this might prove to be the test case, because, as I said, if you could, we talk about many things in law and this and law and that and law. Rupert Griffith and Vincent Lars crossed the floor and nothing happened to them, notwithstanding court cases. So maybe this might be the opportunity to test the waters as to really what representation represents in Tobago.
I take you back to Shakespeare's writings of Julius Caesar. You remember when he made the observation and he said, yon goes Cassius with a lean and hungry look. He thinks too much. Such men are dangerous. And that's the nature of our politics and our politicians. You know that sooner or later, somebody's ambition is going to come to the fore. The same way, okay, look at it. On election night, you saw Watson and Farley hugging up and celebrating in less than a year. The ruptures, were at the surface and, things spilled over into the public space. So sooner or later, within this group of 13, you are going to see something happen one way or the other. Look, remember One Love. Basil Pandey and A.N.R. Robinson. I mean, the whole country was in One Love, except the two leaders who had their own ambitions. And that's the nature of politicians. A politician is a unique creature, you know. Remember, Basil Pandey said it himself. He said, in politics, there are no permanent enemies or friends.
It is the art of compromise. I take that point, and we'll develop those points a bit further, because while we may find it all very fascinating and amusing, it all speaks to the issue of governance and representation in the Sister Isle. We'll take a break at 6:42 in Trinidad and Tobago. We'll continue the discussion with Martin George in a moment. But as we go to that break, here's a traffic update via traffictt.com. It's the Beetham Highway, which is away from the Cacawater, by the way, because it's the eastern main road. Yes, it's the original main road coming into the capital city, which is flooded with sewage. But in the meantime, people are using the Beetham Highway to move right into Port of Spain. We'll be back in our discussion with Martin George right after this.
People will never understand. So when you see this, you take tight, come on, bro.
Wherever you may be, exchanging gifts with your brethren. That's what Christmas means to me.
6:46 in Trinidad and Tobago. As we continue our discussion with Martin George, because, I mean, Mr. George, as a legal professional yourself, I mean, I know it's necessary to tread very carefully with a lot of these things in governance. We have this injunction matter involving the former Commissioner of Police and preventing the Prime Minister from laying the firearms audit report in Parliament, and other issues related to governance. And we understand there's going to be an appeal, and may all go the way of the Privy Council. But in a broad context, if you would care to offer an opinion as to whether all of these legal machinations, whatever they may be, and what they mean as far as the process of on-the-ground good governance. Just to get your perspective on that, if you'd care to.
Yeah, Fazil, you know, I would tell you something. In the early days of my legal career, I can tell you as a fact, there was a sense of honor and dignity in the running of government affairs and governance, whereby, for instance, the Office of the Chief State Solicitor, the Office of the Attorney General, you would be able to reach out to them on legal issues, and you would have been able to observe that, look, hey, you make a compelling legal argument, and, you know, they would sometimes be able to say, okay, yes, you're correct. We're not going to pursue that. We would simply, make the adjustment, etc. What we have seen over the years, Fazil, is a gradual politicization, in the sense that even though the Attorney General's office is supposed to be the Attorney General for all of Trinidad and Tobago, we have seen successive regimes try to exert in one way or another some sort of influence, so that in terms of these public matters, egos come to the fore, and regardless of whether persons are right or wrong, they dig their heels in and they decide, look, we are fighting it to the end, either because we want to save face, we don't want to lose political capital, or we want to gain some sort of mileage with the electorate by showing that, look, we did not concede on that issue, that sort of thing. So therefore, you use the law. In other words, you weaponize the legal system as almost a political tool against your opponents. And as I say, successive regimes have been guilty of doing the same thing. So it's not, pointing fingers one way or another. But the unfortunate reality is that it's the population of Trinidad and Tobago that is worse off for it. It's the taxpayers that end up being worse off for it, because you sometimes ask yourself, after all these legal maneuvers which wind their way up to the Privy Council, after millions of dollars being spent, sometimes billions of dollars, what has really been the end result that has benefited Trinidad and Tobago. You had Petrotrin World GTL with Malcolm Jones. You had Bamboo Networks. You've had so many of these types of matters that have, engaged the court's time, the court's attention. We had Piarco Airport matter just recently. The Privy Council, made a very damning ruling in that regard. We've had the matter recently in Miami with the judge making the ruling, excluding the Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago from the proceedings. And then you saw immediately it was announced that they will appeal and they will fight it. And you ask yourself, is it really being done for the benefit ultimately of the nation, or is it merely being used as a political tool, basically, either to say, well, look, we've stood our ground and we are fighting it still, just so that you don't concede the point. Similarly, I saw, I think yesterday, an announcement by the Attorney General's office that they will appeal this decision. And of course, everybody has the right to use the legal system to pursue your challenges, if you think that you have a legitimate cause of action. But I think that there's always an overriding and overarching duty when you are representing the state of Trinidad and Tobago, that you ought to look beyond the political lens, the red-tinted glasses or the yellow-tinted, pair of Ray-Ban shades that you may want to put on when you are viewing these matters. And you're supposed to basically look at it for the best interest of Trinidad and Tobago with a neutral lens, basically, to say, hey, listen, at the end of the day, what is best for my country? But unfortunately, we have evolved, or maybe I should say devolved, because I'm not sure it's part of the process of evolution to get to that point. I think it's actually a regression that we have come to the state where we are basically politicizing and weaponizing each of these legal matters simply to score points that we can go and boast about, on the political platforms at Pigot Corner or, in Aranguez or, wherever, to say, well, yes, we fought it. And, but the point is, it's the public that ends up suffering. And the question you asked is poignant and potent, because the reality is the man in the street keeps asking, what's the point of all of this except to spend time, money, and to, obfuscate rather than elucidate the legal issues?
And as you said, it's my money being spent because I pay taxes. I don't want to pay it. I would like not to pay it, but I have to pay it or they're coming for me. But the point is, Martin George, with all of that, I mean, as I said, you have Cacao Water in downtown Port of Spain. You have talk about legislation against fireworks, people making noise in people's place in San Francisco. They can't sleep any night, and the police laughing at them, calling them troublemakers. So our institute, notwithstanding what they say, our institutions are collapsing if they haven't collapsed already. You have walk-in services in licensing. You have to wait 5 hours, 10 hours to come back tomorrow because the cash are not there. So in ordinary everyday life is becoming increasingly difficult for ordinary citizens who then have to look at these hoity-toities using my money to fight their political battles. How is this acceptable?
Well, you remember the French author Hugo, described it, so succinctly when he said, life has become short, sharp, and brutish. And, it's almost that we have reached to that point in Trinidad and Tobago. And that's why it's so important for you to keep the conversation going. I can imagine the level of frustration, persons as yourself must feel having to talk about these things, every day, and with seemingly no response from the powers that be. They basically ignore, because there's that sense of a total and complete lack of accountability. There's a lack of that sense of honor and dignity to say, well, listen, I am responsible. When last have we seen a senior government minister step forth and, basically make a mea culpa in that regard? You know, I mean, of course, we've seen a couple, you know, and then people pull them back and say, well, no, I never said that, and I never admitted to that, and, you know, then it gets, you know, twisted into a whole flurry of, you know, denials and counter-denials and accusations and cross-accusations, and, you know, the first thing you hear from those in power when you say, well, why are you doing that? They say, well, but the opposition, when they were in power, they did that too. And, you know, we are locked in this vicious cycle, and it's a downward spiral that is essentially for you a race to the bottom. There's no upward look in that type of argument. You know, it's a cyclical argument that spirals downward.
But help me with this, Martin George, because obviously you're well-schooled, well-educated. I am sure Reginald Moore, Renuka Sagramsel, Suklal, Stewarty, Fitzy, Kitos, everybody well-educated. It doesn't occur to them at some point that notwithstanding the political priorities, which are obviously paramount, that there's another priority which happens to be representation of the people, which happens to be that, you know, all this education, which is supposed to come with it a code of ethics and morals that are not enshrined in Balizé House or wherever the UNC are headquartered now, that it speaks to a broader issue of actually, because I am privileged enough to be in XYZ position, it is my priority not to find out what it dictates from Balizé, but it dictates as what is in the best interest of the people. Isn't there some moral obligation somewhere that validates all this fancy education?
Well, okay, so firstly, let's look back historically, all right? The system of politics, remember, it's developed essentially out of the Greek, you know, scenario, whereby they decided, well, look, you ought to have this, you know, these ideas, these concepts, and they were noble in inception. Unfortunately, they have become polluted, and it's not just in Trinidad and Tobago. You know, you look at the U.S., you look at the basic issues, how everything has become politicized, and of course, it got even magnified under the you know, reign of President Trump. You know, when he, you know, would politicize every single thing, and of course, then the Democrats, then they responded and they politicized things too. And basically, the U.S. is, I think, even worse than we are in terms of that type of polarization. They cannot agree on the simplest thing. I mean, just look at a simple thing as raising the debt ceiling when they have to supposedly get together for that. You know, the amount of political gamesmanship that takes place just to get that done, when they both know that it has to pass, but you always have that, you know, turning it into a political weapon. You look at Europe, you look at, for instance, Italy, all right, you know, with the newly appointed leader, and see how she has politicized the issue of the immigrants and basically use that. You look at France, you look at Le Pen and her stance, you know, basically her far-right stance. So the thing is, people have reached the point where the political vehicle actually takes prominence over the ideas, the noble ideas that the Greeks originally looked at the system of politics for, to serve the people.
I hear you on that. We just have a couple of minutes to wrap up. But surely, I mean, when you're lying on your bed in the night with all this education and good brought-up-see and morals and so on, it don't bother you a little bit to say, well, you know, maybe we should at least think in terms of a higher priority. I understand the politics, and if I want to stay in the politics, if I want to keep feeding at the trough, I need to toe the line. But it don't bother your conscience a little bit, self? Martin
Well,
George?
I don't know if it is that there is some sort of surgical procedure that they do that removes that element of the human nature that is called the conscience when they enter the walls of the parliament. It appears that there's something that they do, I think. And, you know, afterwards, when they are out of politics, then they seem to, it's reinserted, it appears, and all of a sudden they are the ones preaching and pontificating from the outside. But when they were there in office, they were doing exactly what you were describing. And, you know, it's a tragedy for Trinidad and Tobago, particularly given the fact that with the two major parties we have, there appears to be no viable or credible third force at this time that persons can resort to say, hey, listen, if you guys, you know, play the fool, we have an option. And I think that is something that really gives comfort to our leaders and also to the opposition, because basically the opposition are just biding their time to say, well, okay, look, we just wait until it's our turn, and we do the same thing. It ends up being 6 of one and half a dozen of the other.
Martin.
Two sides of the same coin.
Martin George, thank you very much as always for your perspectives. I don't know what else to say, but thank you very much anyway for taking the time to be with us this morning.
Yes, and again, as I said, my reference to glorious oversimplification did not refer to you.
No, I have no problem with that. I have no problem. It might sound extremely naive, but I think that when you're elected to office, it's about and I know. Look, let's leave it at that for the moment. But I take your point, and thank you very much as well for your elucidation and candor. Thank you as always.
Thank you.
You're more than welcome. It's coming up towards the top of the hour. Let's have a traffic update very quickly before we get to the news at 7 o'clock. In fact, we don't have that traffic update now. We'll go to the news. We've come to the end of the first hour of Morning Edition on this Wednesday. When we come back after the news, we'll have our fertility step by step, another edition of that you could look forward to, dealing with the issues surrounding fertility and the Christmas season, which can be very challenging, very emotional, and all that is associated with that. But it's 7 o'clock now in Trinidad and Tobago. Time for the news.